Yes. So I wanted to do an update of a previous video that I did a few months ago called My Family DNA Roots. And the update I wanted to do was in relation to new information from a relative of mine on my mother's side. The estimation that I had made in that previous video was based on the idea that the Baltic Jew element in my heritage was coming from my father's side of the family. But as it turns out, another relative of mine had also done a DNA test which brought up a similar findings to mine, suggesting that the Baltic Jew element was from my mother's side. So with this information, I've done some further research into the history of the region in Jamaica where my mother's family are from, and that revealed some interesting facts that could give some explanation behind those findings in my DNA. The region that I am referring to is Western Jamaica, otherwise known as the County of Cornwall. More specifically, dealing with Westmoreland and St. Elizabeth in the southwest of Jamaica. A town in Westmoreland with a strong family connection up to the present times is a place called Bluefields. The name Bluefields actually goes back to a Dutch Jew going by the name of Abraham Blofeld, who had a base in southwest Jamaica named after him called Bluefields. He was around during the time of Spanish rule on the island, and tensions between the Dutch and the Spanish saw him involved in pirate raids on Spanish ships in the Caribbean region. It is known that the pirates operating on the island were able to recruit the support of Tainos and Maroons, who were runaway slaves, in their actions against the Spanish, and these activities would continue to be carried on from this base during the time of British rule on the island, often with encouragement from the authorities, who were keen not to disturb their privateering enterprises to support their own political and nationalistic aims and dreams of forming a great empire. Bluefeld's main issue with the Spanish was their treatment of the Spanish Jews who had been made exiled, being forced to relocate, many who would end up in the Caribbean, and there is evidence of a significant past Jewish presence around the Bluefields area in Jamaica. The use of Dutch pots in Jamaica, or Dutchies, as it has become known through the musical youth song Pass the Dutchie, can be attributed to the presence of Dutch privateers on the island, something that they brought with them from the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, where they had set up a colony. This style of mega-sized cooking pot was an African innovation, proved by the fact that indigenous Africans they found there were heavily involved in the production of iron, independent of European influence, which is confirmed when looking at records relating to the expeditions of Scottish missionary David Livingstone during the mid-1800s in southern Africa. Du Bois wrote in his 1915 book, The Negro, that Livingstone passed 30 smelting houses in one journey during his time in South Africa. The privateering activities, or piracy, depending on which perspective you would take, would continue to be carried out from this location into the 1800s, with the pirates involved in raids on slave ships bound for Southern America and the USA, and freeing slaves they came across before landing them onto friendly Caribbean islands. It is through this source that my Kenyan ancestors arrived in Jamaica, which I have estimated to have been around the time when slavery had been ended on British-controlled territories in the late 1830s, with the Baltic Jew and Kenyan strains coming together in my DNA with the birth of my own maternal great-grandmother, who must have been at least half Kenyan by blood. Something that is backed up by an old story that my mother told me about my great-grandmother, who was a light-skinned woman in complexion, something that was quite peculiar considering that the area she came from was populated by people who were a deep black in complexion. This would have been the straight out of Africa deep black, free of any kind of non-African historic mixing in their traditionalist homeland, located north of the Great Lake of Central Africa on the Uganda-Kenya border. So this has caused me to slightly revise the breakdown of the table I made for my family DNA roots, moving the Baltic Jew element across to the X chromosome side, which is my mother's side of the family, and moving some of the Creole element across to the Y chromosome on my father's side of the family. Again, as I stated in the previous video, this is just an estimation, so therefore there can be aspects that are incorrect, and if any further information comes up from either side of my family, I will see what I can do to try to correct that. Before I wind up this update into my family DNA roots, I'd just like to return to the subject of this so-called Sierra Leone link in my DNA, which I have contested, calling it Creole instead. As I stated in the previous video, there was a migration of a group of people from Western Jamaica who were carried back to Africa, and that it was more than likely that there is a strong family connection to these people because of this, which is also backed up by the fact that my mother's paternal grandmother had spoken of her maroon identity and the fact that we were no slaves to the British. This goes to show that as much as the British write in their history books how in 1795 they exiled all of the people of Cudjoe Town, which the British called Trelawney Town, after the Second Maroon War, they were not successful in exiling all of its people to Nova Scotia in Canada, which was the original destination for the Cudjoe Maroons. They left behind offspring and others who were able to escape southwards into St. Elizabeth and Westmorelands, possibly in some cases falling under the protection of the pirates operating in that region, or setting up secret camps out of the reach of the British, until finally came the day of emancipation from the physical chains of slavery. A disciplined research of Jamaican history would show that the Maroons were not a purely African people by blood, and in fact had a significant strain in their bloodline coming from the Aboriginal people of Jamaica, sometimes called Arawaks, but who are in fact Taino, described in the history books as being an extinct people, but who are in fact survived within many of the people in the Maroon communities and in wider Jamaican society. This, along with other forms of mixing that might have taken place during their time on the other side of the ocean, forms the foundation for the creation of a unique DNA pattern that has become identifiable within Sierra Leone. There is, however, one other possibility that would give some credence to the idea of heritage coming from this region, but this would rule out the possibility of them being trafficked to the Caribbean for the purpose of slavery. For one, There was very little, if any, slaves taken from that region during the transatlantic slave era, which Walter Rodney points out in his 1970 book, A History of the Upper Guinea Coast, stating that on the ships carrying goods from the region, the number of blacks on board was usually 0. Therefore, if so, they must have arrived there before the time of Columbus, gradually mixing with the Aboriginal people there to form the unique clan of the Taino people. This is indeed a real possibility when we consider what Cheikh Anta Diop wrote in his 1960 book, Pre-Colonial Black Africa, when he said, "The Atlantic is no wall to the blacks of West Africa." John G. Jackson stated in his 1970 book, Introduction to African Civilizations, that the Mandinka people were sending people to the Americas centuries before Columbus. When we add to this that the Maroons were able to settle in Sierra Leone with greater success than the free blacks who had arrived originally, with less opposition from the local indigenous people, shows that there may have been a connection between the two that was being at some level acknowledged. This being said, it is not entirely clear how well the descendants of the migrant former slaves population have been able to integrate with the indigenous population of Sierra Leone, even in modern times, which again promotes an element of doubt in relation to this as being a possibility, even though African presence in the Caribbean pre-Columbus cannot be doubted.